Well, thanks, Lee. Appreciate the opportunity to chat a little bit with you all about thinking about the future. I'm a futurist, as Lee said, and I think about the future. I'm a professional futurist. There are not too many of us, maybe a couple of hundred in the world, who kind of think about the future all the time as a profession. I've written books about it, the technique and the processes by which you think about the future, and certainly worked for a lot of major government agencies and universities and corporations and countries, for that matter, helping them try to systematically think about the future. There are a lot of folks who call themselves futurists who are interested in the future, but there aren't too many who kind of think about it in a systematic and a professional kind of way. And one thing that's different about what I do compared to other futurists is that I kind of think about everything, both horizontal, if you will, horizontally and vertically. I would think about, we track and follow all kinds of stuff about energy and education and technology and those kinds of things, social value change and such. But then I'm here, right? I'm interested in cryon. I'm interested in all of these kind of vertical stuff and the larger kind of reality that exists. There are very few. I don't know of any other futurists who kind of have this comprehensive, integrated kind of picture that I just kind of fell into for a long time ago, because it became obvious to me back in about 1984 or so. I was doing a project where we had brought all together all of the people that held the national security responsibility for the announced candidates who were going to be in the presidential candidates in 1988. And another friend of mine and I got them together, and we met for a half a day once a month for 18 months, trying to build kind of a comprehensive picture of what the future for national security would be for the next 5 to 7 years. We had a strange idea that if we could get a common base, both Republicans and Democrats, that we'd have the ability to have a common framework from which to then present differing points of view. Throughout that process, it was an epiphany for me. It was extraordinary, because what had happened is that I, for the first time, saw all the social value shifts and the technology coming along and the environmental things and all of this stuff coming together, and you could just see it out there on the horizon. You could see the essential kind of things that we're going through now back at that time, and it had a profound kind of impact on me, and certainly kind of catalyzed the basic feeling that I had that there was something really big coming, and that I needed to be involved in that. And that was my purpose in life, if you will. And so I've been all around the world and done all kinds of things with lots of people who are been interested in the future. And let me tell you a little bit about how that all works. First of all, there isn't any futures that's worth anything. Who can make predictions and tell you what they think literally is going to happen. I mean, we all play around and say that we're pretty sure about some things. But I mean, in terms of a systematic kind of approach to trying to look at the future, you really can't predict. There's Nobel Prize winning science around the notion of chaos theory and other things that'll tell you that every time somebody makes a decision, you open up the possibilities for a new future to arise, for a different future to arise. And so what happens today, right now, is a derivative of extraordinary amount of other kind of people and things that have made decisions and stuff that has happened that you just have no way of knowing what's going to happen. And so there's no way that you can literally predict the future. And what that means, if you think about it a little bit, is that you can't do extrapolation. People are going to make decisions and do different kind of things unless you think that everybody's going to do the same thing and think the same way as they always have. And so that the future is going to be just an incremental kind of difference from the past, then it's likely to dramatically kind of change at one time or another. So it's not a project, you can't do this extrapolation kind of trajectory kind of stuff. I mean, a lot of people do. They call them forecasts and they make good livings doing those kinds of things, but that's not how the future works. The future, if you look historically, is what evolutionary biologists call a punctuated equilibrium. What you have is long periods of time that are largely equilibrium, that are all kind of flat. You get kind of the same stuff with slight increases in what's going on. And then it gets punctuated. There's a big change in a short period of time, and that then drives into the next era. And so whether it goes from single cellular life to multiple cellular life to vertebrates to mammals to, going from hunter-gatherers to active agriculture, and then moving into cities and towns, and that's when the first language showed up, and so on, and you work your way up until you get Gutenberg's movable type, which fundamentally changed the way human beings communicated ideas and proliferated ideas, and that changed the whole metabolism of the whole system, kind of eviscerated the Catholic Church and all of their plans for what they were going to do and take over the world because suddenly the Bible was available all over the place and guys like Martin Luther showed up. And if you keep following that sequence, then what you come up into is the industrial age, which was kind of a derivative of the books and the communications and the things that came from the movable type. And then you got the computers, the advent of the computer and the internet, and what's happening is that each time you go through one of those paradigm shifts, one of those transitions, what you find out is the transition gets shorter and shorter each time by about 10 times shorter. And the subsequent eras are 10 times shorter than the previous eras. So it's getting faster and faster and faster. And the amount of information content in each succeeding era is about 10 times what the previous one was. And so what you get is this exponential curve. And it's an exponential curve that's kind of got these stair steps as it works its way up. And what it ends up being is that you can figure out that 500 years ago, for instance, Gutenberg did his movable type. You had the computer showed up about 50 years ago, and the next time it's 10 times, that's 5 years long, and so on. And that's where you get these amazing kind of transitions into a new world. Ray Kurzweil, famous, one of the best-known futurists around, who's extraordinary on technology. He doesn't look at much else but technology. He says that there will be 1,000 times the technological change in this century as there was in the last century. And if you just think a minute about what that means, in the last centuries, it started with horses and buggies and things in New York City. One of the biggest concerns they had was how they were going to deal with the projected amount of horse manure was going to be in the streets of Manhattan. You got airplanes for the first time in 1903, and in that century you went to the moon, and you got the internet and all of the crazy kind of things in the world that we live in, and you say, and you're going to multiply that times 1,000 times into the next century. This is crazy. And I'm telling you, if you parse it down to smaller pieces in the next 10 years, you get something like 70 times the change that you've had in the last century. And that's certainly happening. And so the question is, how do you make sense out reality in that period of time. Well, I told you that you can't do projection. You can't do these kind of linear kind of things. And so that the way that you make sense out of the future, and it's a very powerful technique that's been used very, very successfully, is to do scenarios. And scenarios are the whole business of trying to build pictures, integrated, systematic, internally consistent pictures about what alternative worlds might show up. And you build those pictures through a very rigorous kind of multi-day process of trying to say, what is it in particular that's important to you, whoever you are, the client, and what is it that your kind of future hinges on? In the business, we call those critical uncertainties, things that are critical but uncertain. They're essentially hinge issues. So if they go one way, the future goes one direction. If they go the other way, that goes the other direction. And that's where the big changes go. That's where the big potential changes and surprises are. And that's what you've got to really think about, because if you can isolate those and bring those down and understand not only if that change happens, that it will happen, but then build around it a kind of an integrated kind of picture of what a world like that might look like. And we're going to come in, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about that in a minute. But if you can do that, then what you've got, and you do about 3 or 4, 5 of them. If you do it right, what you effectively do is you blanket the horizon. You go from one side to another in the terms that you're interested in. You can build scenarios about anything. What my mother's going to have for breakfast next week, or crazy anything. You can build scenarios about where you should go to college and what you should major in and so on. You can do it systematically, so you can think about it. And a great deal of the value comes from the process to systematically go through and think about all of the possibilities and array them in an organized kind of way. And when you do that, what you do is you cover a lot of the big bases, and you certainly extract the possibilities that you otherwise certainly wouldn't have seen, and you identify those things that are really quite critical to whatever your organization or your family or your company or whatever it is that you're thinking about. And like I say, people have done this very, very successfully, because big businesses, this got started, the scenario planning got started with Royal Dutch Shell, and they used it specifically to become, at the time, the largest oil company in the world. And Peter Schwartz, who was very active in doing this and responsible for it for Royal Dutch Shell, tells this extraordinary story about how that having gone through the alternative scenarios about different prices of what oil might come and how the company would react depending upon what the price might be. There was a period of time when the price of oil went down to something like $5 a barrel for a short period of time, and he talks about how they had the shortest board meeting in the history of the company, because they knew exactly what they were going to do, and they bought up all the lease rights in the North Sea, and they instantaneously became the biggest operator in the space. And they did that because they had systematically thought about all of these things in a way. And so I can tell you all kinds of stories about how we've done this. I've taken back 25 years ago, probably, I took 60 editors and publishers of all of the major newspapers in the country through, what did we do? We did 6-7 two-day scenario planning sessions about what the future of news and newspapers were. at the advent, and this was right at the advent of the internet, and so there was a lot of concerns about what's this internet thing and what's the World Wide Web going to do and so on. And what I can tell you is that we anticipated everything that has happened to the newspaper business now. We anticipated Craigslist. We didn't know the name of it, but we figured out that that is what was going to happen. All these people are going to get online and they were going to sell all kinds of things online. And it was going to just cut the legs off of the classified advertising. Newspapers, of course, can't sell their newspaper for generate nearly enough money from just the sale of the paper to justify all of the to cover all of the costs, and so they're fundamentally dependent upon advertising. And one of the components of advertising are the want ads, the classified ads on the back of what used to be the back of the newspapers, and the other one are the display ads, all the big ones, right? And what you could tell, and you could see going forward, you could see an Amazon. Didn't know the name of it, but you could tell, you could see how people would all get together and be able to become publishers of their own thing in terms of opinion. So all the role that the newspapers played in terms of driving the ideas and the opinion on the opinion page and the op-eds and stuff, all of that we had all before. And I had a guy who was in the middle of it, who was one of the participants, who was a friend of mine who was a reporter for the Washington Post, and he got out of the thing and says, "I'm selling my Washington Post stock. This is crazy." It was a little, and part of the problem was that we were early. We couldn't tell exactly when it was going to happen, and that's part of the problem with one of the kind of intrinsic issues with thinking about the future is that the timing, it's hard to get the timing right. It seems that's an issue in the metaphysical space as well, if you with with channelers and intuitives and other kinds of things. What they'll all agree to is they don't know exactly about the time. They can see the stuff coming, and so in the futures business, it's kind of like that. And so there's a whole lot of things like that that we've been fortunate to see coming downstream. We're always early. Thought it was going to be a little bit earlier than it was, and then when it comes like a train, and so it's you find yourself in this interesting position of always kind of hanging out in the front and talking about thinking about things that nobody else is there yet, and so it's hard sometimes for people to kind of fully appreciate the kind of things that are in your head because you can see it all. And so scenarios and this notion of thinking of scenarios is a very powerful, and it's the most significant thing. I took this idea and built the first national surprise anticipation system for the government of Singapore. We figured out that every time I'd go and build some scenarios, I'd look at it and say, yeah, these are really good and great, but reality is a lot more complex than 5 little scenarios. And so what we did for Singapore is to build a database of 1,000 or more scenarios about big things that would kind of eat their lunch if they happened, and so that they could anticipate them and then tie that together into the search engines and key ideas, prerequisite events, things that would happen before the thing that was of interest to them. And then you could tie that into search engines and search terms, and then you could kind of automate it. And we put it together with all of the agencies, the government in Singapore. And it became the first effort and first capability like that in the world to kind of have all the agencies looking out in terms of what they were particularly interested in, and then an integrated kind of picture of what the whole government was looking for. And you have read some about how effective that Singapore and how rapidly they've responded to the coronavirus, and I can tell you exactly that the reason why they've been able to do that in part was because the response to some of the things that we helped them think through, because it was SARS, if you remember SARS, was the thing that kicked off that whole project. When their Minister of Defense came to me and asked me, we got surprised by SARS. We don't ever want to get surprised again. Can you help us do that? And so that's what we did. So scenarios are very powerful and very useful. But there's a problem. There's a problem with scenarios. And yeah, it's a Fred problem. Here, come on over to the house and I'll explain it to you. So this is Fred. Fred the fish. I think his name is Freddie Mercury, but we call him Fred. And Fred is a really nice little fish. And it's kind of hard to tell, because it's hard to get inside of his little fish brain. But we think he's a happy fish. I mean, he's got full run of the place. He doesn't have any competition. Food falls out of the sky 3 times a day. I mean, it's kind of a good deal. And he's a curious little fish. He runs all over the place and looks at everything. And, you know, he's been around for a long time now, and he's probably pretty convinced that he knows how everything works in this kind of space. And if you could get inside of Fred's little fish brain, and you'd ask him how the world works, he would tell you, I suspect, about all the things that he knows and how it's predictable, and that food comes out of the sky. And that would be his understanding of how all this works. But let me tell you something. Fred would not probably be able to tell you and realize that he's an abrogator. He is an eliminator. And Fred is a part of a system. And I don't think he understands this. I mean, it's hard to say for sure. But I don't think that he understands that he's part of this larger system where his eliminations contribute to an integral way to a little aquaponics operation that we got going here, where the plants are growing on the top, and Fred's eliminations fertilizes the water that then feeds the plants. And Fred probably doesn't understand that, and doesn't know that that's what's going on. And so he's limited by kind of his environment. And you know, we've tried to talk to Fred. Look, you can click on here, and he doesn't even come over. We've tried to train him to and we're only, you know, a fraction of an inch away from him here, and he doesn't even get it. You know, he doesn't know. And if in some kind of strange way that Fred had some kind of epiphanal dream and thought that the world was really going to change, and that in a short period of time that he'd have to figure out a way how to live outside of his aquarial home, then Fred would be limited to thinking about his possibilities only in terms of what he has experienced and what he knows. And so all of his options would be aquatic ones, I would think. And that's the problem. That's the Fred problem. We're all Freds. We're all fish living in an environment that we're familiar with. And we're prisoners of those assumptions and that environment. And we don't see the larger system. We don't understand that there's a whole lot going on here, not only in terms of the close-in one, where he's part of this aquaponics thing, but he certainly has no idea, as best we can tell, that there are all these people and things on the outside. And so that's the Fred problem. That's our fish problem that you have to deal with. And that kind of shapes the whole environment and the kind of options that are available to us, because all of us operate and come from an environment that we're familiar with, that we believe, within the terms that we operate, are define what the options are that are available to us. And we are then limited to, by those ideas, to the kinds of potential kind of decisions and places and ideas that we think about. There's kind of a principle here. It's about sense making, and sense making all comes from pattern recognition. If you do not recognize a pattern of one sort or another, you do not know what it means. And the patterns, the sense making, is all a derivative of the patterns that you brought into the room with you, right? From all of your history and where you've been. And so when you first are exposed to a new situation that that's unfamiliar to you, the thing that you initially do is work your way around the room or the situation, and you look at it and you try to find patterns and try to make sense out of it in terms of something that you've known in the past. And there's a lot of problems with that, because if you're into space, exponential space, going into breakthroughs on top of breakthroughs into what's going to be a new world, then you don't have that kind of, the new world by definition is not going to operate like the old world. That's one of the principles. Remember I told you about the punctuated equilibrium? That's one of the principles, and that is that you cannot make sense of the future from the framework of the past. That the previous era operates with a whole bunch of different rules and assumptions and all kinds of things that are quite different in the future. And so you got this spread problem. You've got you're locked up in this context, in this environment, and you think you got an idea about how it all works because you've got all this history, and you can't see it. It turns into something that's really quite different. And you don't have to be very creative to kind of look around right now and see about all this coronavirus and the amazing kind of changes that it's brought in a short period of time, and that not a one of us have ever, in any kind of detailed way anticipated that this was going to happen. And I mean, you've got guys like Martin Armstrong, who's the most extraordinary kind of predictor. He's got some software like a computer that's never been wrong, and his computer says that if we don't get this thing turned around in a hurry, that it goes for 13 years, like continuing deep kind of depression, and it doesn't turn around until 2032. Well, who knows? I mean, a number of things, and we don't have the time here to talk about the details, but there's a number of ways in which that could change, and it could be different. But the fact of the matter is, you're into some space where just nobody's ever seen it before. And so in this extraordinary kind of environment that's going exponentially toward into a new world and a new human, you got to have a new way in which to make sense out of all of this. And Greg Braden and I and a number of other folks are at the front end of a whole project to essentially develop a new kind of way in which to look about it, to deal with all of this kind of change and the new world that's going to show up. And we hope that you'll hear a whole lot more about it in the future. But let me tell you just very briefly about the whole idea. And the idea is that you build a vision for a desired future, which in the futures business is called a normative scenario. And if you build a vision of what that future is, that new world might look like, And you've spent the time and got all kinds of people together, and as a matter of fact, got millions of people around the world to all participate in it, which is what we're headed for. We're working on. Then what you've got is, and Tryon will tell you this, that when you get a whole lot of people that are thinking about the same thing, you get entrainment, and then what happens is that you get what I'm calling a familiar attractor. Not a strange attractor from chaos theory, but a familiar one that a lot of people think about, and it attracts and it pulls us forward into this desired world. I believe that we're at this amazing time in history where, for the first time, humanity has not only the capability and the tools and the knowledge to understand broadly what's happening, which we've never had before, but also the imperative to develop and design our own future. And we have the opportunity to do that, and so that's what some of us are trying to work on, to get a whole new idea about what a new future could be and how it could operate and what the principles and the values and other kinds of things, and begin to hold that up so a whole lot of folks can climb on and kind of embellish it and change it and shape it and help us get from here to there as soon as possible. And so that's what we're working on. And you'll hear more about that in the future. So thanks.